population of 18th century Cornwall was more diverse than many people imagine. Olaudah Equiano's narrative is a first-person account of the experience of arriving in Britain for the first time at Falmouth as an enslaved African child. It's a compelling account which helps to further abolition of the slave trade. For most individuals of African descent who arrived in Cornwall in the 18th century, we don't have that personal first-hand account. But we can see from the records, including the 1700 probate of Thomas Corker, that most people either worked in households or went to sea. In the early 18th century, the default assumption seems to have been that a black person who was not known in the neighbourhood might be a runaway. Many individuals were identified as servants rather than as enslaved. And this is a memorial to Philip Scipio, who was a servant of Sir William Morris. Some people of African descent received annuities in wills. They were christened, married, buried, and memorialised in Cornwall's parish churches. And they appear in other local records, other parish records, and records of the quarter sessions. So that, for example, Caesar McGrahan, who was a servant of Mrs. Foote, was ordered to pay for the upkeep of a child he had fathered outside of marriage. And what that shows, amongst other things, is that he had financial resources. He was a servant rather than regarded as enslaved. There were servants and mariners who married and had families. So Maria, for example, who was born in Africa and came to Penryn in the 1760s, was christened when she was 9 years old at St. Cluvier's Church. She married 3 times, she had a family, and in old age she lived with her daughter and granddaughter at Penryn. It's not always possible to identify black individuals who appear in paintings, and in this case we don't know the name of the young servant. What we do know is that the other individuals in the painting had associations with people of African descent. So the man in a red waistcoat, who's probably John Oliver Williams of Carnanton, was married to Charlotte Townsend, a merchant's daughter who was partly of African descent. Charlotte's brother was Lord Mayor of London and the MP for Looe in Cornwall. And some historians have suggested that he may have been the first black MP because he was partly of African descent. Charlotte and James's 2 other sisters and brother also married into Cornish families. So Judith married Thomas Hawes, who was instrumental in encouraging Captain Newton, a former slave ship captain, to enter the church. And Captain Newton then became an advocate for the abolition of the slave trade. Sarah Townsend married Thomas Biddulph, who was the vicar of Padstow, and Joseph Townsend married Joyce Nankiville of St. Agnes. By the 1780s, it's clear that Cornwall's ports and maritime communities were diverse, partly because of the presence of black mariners. Historians have estimated that around 3% of mariners on British ships in the late 18th century were of African descent, and that compares in Cornwall with estimates that around 2.8% of the population were members of Methodist societies. So it's possible that in Cornwall's maritime communities and ports, it would have been as common to meet a black mariner as a Methodist. Passengers travelling on the Lisbon and West Indies packets at Falmouth commented on the black presence. William Beckford, for example, some of whose wealth was based on plantations in the West Indies, described Falmouth as characterised by the society of Barbados Creoles and packet boat captains. In 1786, when a smuggling crew escaped from Pendennis Castle, one of the men was described as William Stone, and he was described as having a black complexion, but also as an Irishman who lived in Guernsey. So you can begin to see the emergence of something which looks and sounds quite like modern identities where people are identified as black, but also as an Irishman or indeed a Cornish man. Black mariners were appear on crew lists, and if they were in the Navy, they received payment. They were eligible for a share of prize money if they were engaged in action where prize money was payable. If they were prisoners of war, their upkeep was paid for, and they might be eligible for a pension. The musician Joseph Emity, who came to Cornwall, was a mariner and was in the Navy for 4 years. And he left HMS Indefatigable at Falmouth when it was paid off. He received payment, he may have been eligible for prize money, and it's not impossible that he would have been eligible for a pension. Joseph Emity was educated, he could read and write. This is his signature is in Cornish parish records. He taught music, he was a composer. He played with keen amateur musicians. He performed in Falmouth and rehearsed at the Old Town Hall in Falmouth. He played at the Assembly Rooms in Truro. And he married in Cornwall and had a family. I want to talk a little bit about his descendants and what their lives show about the identities of people of African descent living in Cornwall in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So Joseph Emity married Jane or Jennifer Hutchings, who we know was white because his children were described in press reports as being mulattoes and of mixed race. Joseph and Jane Emity had 8 children. 3 of their sons died quite young, including one who had been sentenced to 6 months hard labour and who died when he was 14. But their 2 daughters lived to be adults and worked as dressmakers in Truro and later as greengrocers. And his 3 sons who lived to be adults were musicians and professional performers. Of those 3 sons, Thomas was a musician who had a quadrille band in Truro, and I think it's quite interesting that he had a quadrille band because the historian Rodriguez King Dorset, in looking at black dance in London, found that quadrille was one of the dances which was adopted and adapted by the black dance culture in London, which also had its origins in African dance. A second son of Joseph and Jane Emity, William, was also a musician, and he played for many years and led the Liverpool Zoological Gardens band. So he moved to Liverpool, had a family there, and headed up the Liverpool Zoological Gardens band. The third son, James, was an equestrian and circus performer. And it's in some of the advertisements and press reports of James's activities that the mixed experience of individuals of African descent can be seen. On the one hand, James was hugely successful and very much appreciated and admired as an equestrian. On the other hand, as he developed his career, he was faced with some circumstances which today would be characterized as racist. So, for example, James Emity appeared in a circus and the advertisements described him as an African man of colour. In that performance, there was also a troupe of dancers who performed a dance in commemoration of the abolition of slavery. And although that might seem positive, it was probably actually a blackface troupe of dancers, because they also can be seen, the same troupe of 8 dancers can be seen performing other dances in which they were not blackface. James Emity also, in 1838, had a performance routine which was described as a laughable act of horsemanship, in which he appeared as Jim Crow. As his career developed, James Emity was very successful, and he eventually acquired his own equestrian circus. He returned to Cornwall to perform, and there are performances which were advertised and reviewed from St. Just in the west of Cornwall to Wadebridge in the east. Perhaps one of his most successful moments was when James Emity actually drove 28 horses to Greenwich in London, and he can be seen in this picture, which was on the front of the Illustrated London News in 1844, holding the reins of the 28 horses. And this print was actually something which was also printed as a print that people could have on their wall. So there are accounts of the fact that many inns and hotels had this print framed and on their walls in social areas, in inns and in hotels. I think what's quite interesting, thinking about the lives of the children of Joseph and Jane Emity, is that they, the way in which they developed their careers possibly reflects, partly reflects their African heritage, and I think it also reflects the fact that Joseph Emity was educated in Portugal and partly shared a Portuguese heritage. So I think James's interest, for example, in the equestrian arts may be something which drew on what he learned from his father of his Portuguese heritage. And also Cecilia, one of Joseph and Jane Emity's daughters, actually converted to Roman Catholicism. So she moved, she didn't marry, but she moved to Liverpool with her brother William, and was involved in helping to raise her nieces and nephews. But she also, in Liverpool, converted to Roman Catholicism.